Good day, students of economics. Continuing our journey of Unit 3, National Income and Price Determination. The focus of this video lecture is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, think federal government. Federal government, think the House and the Senate, which we call what? Congress, so the House of Representatives, right? And the Senate, Congress, and the President, El Presidente, right? That's the executive branch. Collectively, they represent the federal government. This idea of fiscal policy is going to investigate how active changes in either the level of government spending or the level of taxation and transfer payments will ultimately affect the economy. So the term discretionary fiscal policy is in order here because there will always be a certain level of taxation in the economy and a certain level of government spending, and there will always be transfer payments. This idea of fiscal policy investigates when the government takes active role in attempting to close either that recessionary gap or inflationary gap investigated earlier when we talked about leftward or rightward decrease or increase shift in aggregate demand. So the purpose of this lecture is to discuss fiscal policy and the tools used by the government. Again, taxation, spending, transfer payments. And then we're going to examine how these changes in government spending and or tax and transfer payments affect aggregate demand directly and indirectly. More on that momentarily. When the economy is in a recession, we're going to use the term expansionary fiscal policy, changes in taxes and government spending and transfers to try to kickstart the economy. And when the problem is demand pull inflation, the term contractionary fiscal policy applies. But again, both of them are aimed at restoring what's called full employment domestic output, where we have our nice alignment of AD, SRAS, and LRAS at potential GDP. We're going to examine extensively about ADAS graphical short-run effects of fiscal policy. Already watched the John Maynard Keynes video. You should already understand the idea of the multiplier. Mathematically, we will explain the difference between using expenditures versus taxes as recipe or medicine for the economy. And finally, we'll talk about this idea of lags in discretionary fiscal policy, among other criticisms. So where did this idea of fiscal policy come from? Classical theorists versus Keynesians. Not all, but most economists believe that the government should take an active role in assuring the economy doesn't completely go off the rails. So after the Great Depression, by the way, that's an oxymoron, Great Depression. Shouldn't they call it the horrible depression? Great in magnitude, not great in that it was a good thing. After the Great Depression and surviving World War II, there was a piece of legislation passed called the Employment Act of 1946. And what did this piece of legislation do? Well, it established first the Council of Economic Advisors and the Joint Economic Activity, and in essence said, Uncle Sam, the federal government, the President, the House, the Senate, Congress, should do everything within their powers to help the economy sustain full employment domestic output, to never allow something like the Great Depression to occur again. So that's the idea of government involvement in the economy to fix or address that recessionary gap, or to take measures to reduce an inflationary gap. Before investigating the economics of fiscal policy, it's important to review the concept of the multiplier. John Maynard Keynes introduced this idea into macroeconomic thinking with his writing during the Great Depression. The idea is pretty straightforward, that an initial change in spending ultimately causes a more cumulative impact on GDP after considering several rounds of spending. So spending for one individual becomes income for another, and such on and so on. And the multiplier can work as a positive effect on the economy or contractor. Right? So This question says, assume the MPC in an economy is 0.8. What is MPC? Marginal propensity to consume. Anything marginal is change. So if there's a change in income, what percentage of that change in income do people on average spend? So if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, that means on average people will spend 80% of their change in income. So if the government cut taxes by 100 billion and on average people spent about 80% of that tax cuts, the marginal propensity to consume in the economy would be 0.8. Now that number, the marginal propensity to consume, the MPC, that's important because it helps us calculate the size of the multiplier. You should know already what is the formula for the size of the multiplier. The multiplier equals 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, or 1 over the marginal propensity to save. So if on average people spend 80% of their change in income, that means they save 20% of their change in income, because this is after-tax disposable income, right? So assume the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, and the government increases government purchases of goods and services by 60 million. All right, now for the moment, assume the absence of taxes, international trade, and changes in aggregate price level. So the first question is, what is the value of the spending multiplier? All right, what is the value of the spending multiplier? I just gave you that formula, 1 over or 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, or 1 over the marginal propensity to save. Right? 0.8 marginal propensity to consume, 0.2 marginal propensity to save. That adds up to 1 or 100% of disposable income. By how much will real GDP change as a result of the increase in government purchases? Right? So in that case, you have to say, okay, what is the size of the multiplier? What is the size of the initial change in spending? In this case, 60 million, and then do the math. Right? What would happen to the size of the effect on real GDP if the MPC, the marginal propensity to consume, fell? If people on average spent less of their change in income? And then finally explain that part, why that would be the phenomena or effect. Suppose the government collects 60 million in taxes to balance its 60 million in expenditures, part D here. By how much would real GDP change as a result of this increase in both government spending and taxes? So the last part says, what if the government collects 60 million in taxes after spending 60 million on goods and services? In total, how much will the GDP change? All right, get to work, hit pause, and then let's see how you did. All right, students, four-part question here. Let's see how we did A, B, C, D. First question says, what is the size of the spending multiplier if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8? This one's straightforward. It's a formula. 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume, or 1 over the marginal propensity to save. 1 over 1 minus 0.8, or 1 over 0.2. The spending multiplier is 5, right? Make sure you look at that formula. Simply taking the formula of 1 over 1 minus the MPC gives us the answer of 5. Next question is, okay, what's going to be the total change in GDP if the government spends 60 million? So we simply take the initial change in spending, which is initiated by the government, 60 million, and we multiply it by the size of the multiplier, right? So 60 times 5, $300 million increase in GDP. Why is it an increase? Because the government spent $60 million, let's assume, on new roads, and then if we assume the multiplier effect of 5, given a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, total increase in GDP is 300 million. Next question says, okay, what if the marginal propensity to consume was less? How would that ultimately impact the size or the magnitude of the multiplier? It would be less, because if people on average spend less of their change in income, the size of the multiplier would decline, because the multiplier is determined by 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. If we make the denominator bigger, let's say the marginal propensity to consume is only 0.75 instead of 0.8, 1 over 1 minus 0.75, 1 over 0.25. Now the multiplier is all the way down to 4. All right. Now, the next question requires a little thinking. And it says, okay, what's the cumulative impact on GDP when it's all said and done if the government spends 60 million but then collects 60 million in tax revenue? Well, we already did the math for the first part. The initial change in spending, 60 million, right? Multiplied by the size of the multiplier gives you 300 million. So we're 300 million up. But then if the government takes out of the economy 60 million in taxes, right? Now here's where we need what's called the tax multiplier. See this answer says 60 million times, and it's 0.8 over 0.2. That's the tax multiplier, right? Now what do we mean by the tax multiplier? Well, okay, let's start off with a more straightforward example. Let's say instead of spending $100 million to stimulate the economy, the government cut taxes. Well, here's the problem. People are going to save some of that tax cut. So the effect of a tax cut is not going to be as large as government spending because some of the tax cut is saved. So the tax multiplier, the formula for that is MPC over MPS. But here's a little trick. The tax multiplier will always be one less than the spending multiplier. So in our little example, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, that makes the marginal propensity to consume 0.2. 0.8 over 0.2, the math works. This tax multiplier is 4, right? But we know if the spending multiplier is 5, then by default, this tax multiplier is always one less than the spending multiplier. So we have 60 multiplied by 4, 240. So we got 300 million injection in GDP, 240 million taken out when we consider the taxes collected, the cumulative effect of that after the tax multiplier. We look at the difference between the 300 and the 240, and that comes out to 60 million for the last answer. All right, let's go through this idea piece by piece. We say, okay, we understand from the previous module this idea of long run. In the long run, this idea of self-righting or self-adjusting to long run equilibrium. And we talked about examples of, let's say there is a recessionary gap caused by a decrease in consumer and investment spending. Aggregate demand shifts left, real GDP falls, downward pressure on price level, higher unemployment. Well, that lower price level ultimately in the long run, now you can't put a definitive time on this, but in the long run would cause what? A decrease in nominal wages. That would lead to an increase in short-run aggregate supply, and eventually we'd come back to long-run equilibrium at a lower price level. Here's the kicker. Look here, it says adjustments could take a decade or more. So again, this debate between or among the classical theorists who believe that the capitalist system and the markets should be left to their druthers, the government shouldn't get involved, as opposed to the Keynesians who think, there is some fiscal policy warranted. Now, here's the idea down bottom that says, right, you say, okay, well, we probably shouldn't wait for things to get really out of control for fiscal policy to be implemented to push the economy back towards potential GDP. Now, I'm going to give you 3 recessions and then talk about whether or not fiscal policy was warranted. When George Bush, the son, took office, the economy was in a mild recession. Total contraction of economic output was less than 1%. Unemployment didn't even get as high as 6%, right? But the economy was also rearing from the 9/11 attack. So it was a very strange time. Bush implemented some tax rebates to working households to kickstart or jumpstart the economy. And whether that was warranted or necessary depends on your view, right? As opposed to the 2008 recession and the pandemic recession, it was blatantly obvious to anyone that government intervention and fiscal stimulus was absolutely necessary to keep the economy from falling into the chasm of catastrophe, right? So this is a good debate on the idea of classical theorists versus Keynesians and how much government involvement is necessary. But we're going to talk about assuming fiscal policy is warranted. What is the purpose of expansionary and contraction fiscal policy, and how does it affect the economy? All right, how does fiscal policy ultimately work? Right? Now here's the idea. The government can spend money, or the government can change the level of taxation and transfer payments. So we're going to talk about the idea of direct or indirect influence on aggregate demand. So typically we talk about fiscal policy aimed at influencing aggregate demand. Remember, aggregate demand, C, I, G, and X. Well, G, government spending, is part of aggregate demand. Well, then when the government increases spending, when the government increases purchases of social capital, military output, right? Like in today's world with the Biden CHIPS Act, spending billions trying to stimulate the domestic production of computer chips, and the Green Energy Act, right? Disguised as what we call, the Inflation Reduction Act. That type of government purchases will have a direct impact on aggregate demand. As opposed if the government takes the other approach on fiscal policy, and that is changes to tax rates and or transfer payments. Here's why: because those policy measures will ultimately have an indirect impact on aggregate demand because it changes the level of disposable income, and households can decide what percentage of that change in income is ultimately spent. So identify the difference between direct and indirect impact of fiscal policy, whether it be government spending, direct, as opposed to changes in tax rates and transfer payment changes, indirect. Assume the economy is at full employment domestic output, or the potential level of output when we're firing on all cylinders. All right, so we got about 2.5% GDP growth, and we got about 4% unemployment. We got about 2% inflation. Everything's hunky-dory, happy-go-lucky, perfect, and then something messes it up. So what do we mean by something messing it up? For now, let's just concentrate on recessionary gap and inflationary gap. All right? So it's okay, when or how will the fiscal policy changes in government tax rates or government spending and transfers, right? Ultimately, how does that shift aggregate demand? Well, when should it be, used? When would we want the government to implement fiscal policy? So I just discussed the idea of we're at full employment and then something happens. A leftward shift in aggregate demand causes what? A recessionary gap. So a fall in private sector spending, consumer spending drops, right? Investment spending drops. We have raising unemployment. Unemployment's going up in the economy. Real GDP is falling. Downward pressure on the aggregate price level. We would want some government stimulus, some expansionary fiscal policy. The other time we might consider implementing some fiscal policy to affect aggregate demand is if we have the other problem. What if aggregate demand becomes excessive, causing a inflationary gap, right? Too much money chasing too few goods. Real GDP is beyond our potential economic output. Right? Cyclical unemployment, not existent. Right? The actual unemployment rate's below the natural rate of unemployment. So we have a little bit less frictional unemployment than we typically do. But spending is excessive, pushing up price levels. Then we'll consider the use of contractionary fiscal policy to put this back in order. All right, quick economists, look to the right. What do we have? Graph here. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Boom, recognize what's going on. But always look at the difference between where we are, recessionary gap at E2 versus potential GDP. So we notice that currently the economy is in a recession. All right, aggregate demand has shifted leftward. So private sector spending is weak. Consumer spending has fallen. Gross business investment has faltered. All right, ask why? Well, it could be that household indebtedness, all of a sudden the housing market's suffering. Could be that businesses don't see much on profit expectations and horizons for the next few months to a year, right? So leftward shift in aggregate demand, we're in a recession. Weak GDP, so falling real aggregate outputs, right? Negative GDP, high unemployment, we have cyclical unemployment, downward pressures on aggregate price level. What can the federal government do to fix the situation? In this case, when the economy is in a recession, the federal government, that is the House, the Senate, the President, should institute expansionary fiscal policy. The government wants to expand economic activity. Remember, discretionary fiscal policy is aimed at aggregate demands. So they can take this direct approach or this indirect approach, right? So let's think about the options for the government. If the economy is in a recession characterized by, right, falling real GDP, high unemployment, and downward pressure on the aggregate price level, the goal is for the federal government to try to stimulate economic activity, to try to expand aggregate demand from its current level where there's a recessionary gap back towards full employment output, aka potential GDP. So the government can take a few approaches. The government can implement increases in government purchases, aka government spending. The government can increase transfer payments, right? That's unemployment benefits, welfare benefits, right? And the government could cut taxes. Now, which approach is best? That is a debate of the ages. Typically, right-leaning economists, conservative economists, and right-leaning politicians, they're advocates of tax cuts, right? Left-leaning economists and left-leaning politicians, they generally are proponents of government spending and increases in transfer payments, right? So what happens if we use any and all, right? The idea is what? If we are in a recessionary gap where real output is falling short of potential, we implement some expansionary fiscal stimulus, expansionary fiscal policy, increase in government spending, tax cuts, increase in transfer payments, and the goal is to shift aggregate demand from its current level, where there's a recessionary gap, back towards full employment output or potential GDP. All right, let's evaluate expansionary fiscal policy. So remember, the economy is in a recession, aggregate demand has shifted left, recessionary gap characterized by real GDP well short of potential GDP, high unemployment, so the economy is experiencing cyclical unemployment. So we look at that idea of Ocon's law, right? We look at actual unemployment minus natural rate of unemployment times 2. That'll tell us that size of that recessionary gap or that GDP gap, negative GDP gap. All right, downward pressure on prices because lots of people unemployed. All right, lots of businesses at 62% capacity. So no upward pressure on wages, no upward pressure on resource prices, right? Sort of disinflation, deflation environment. So the government can implement an increase in government spending, or the government could cut taxes. Right? So that's the approach. Now, this is an important point because you're going to be given questions like this on the AP exam. It says a $100 billion increase in government spending is equivalent to a $133 billion increase in tax cuts. When you think about both options, now how is that the case? Now, again, this idea of the direct impact or influence on the economy versus the indirect. If the federal government spends $100 billion, let's just keep it simple. Let's say they spend it all on road improvements, right? Theoretically, every one of those dollars hits the pavement. Get it? Right? Yeah, you get it. Right? So every one of those $100 billion goes into the economy. And assume in this world that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. So 1 over 1 minus 0.75 or 1 over 0.25. We have a multiplier of 4. So ultimately, GDP expands by $400 billion. But if the government cuts taxes, people are going to save some of that tax cut. So if the government cuts taxes by that same 100 billion, well, what happens? Well, only 75 billion gets spent. Because the marginal propensity to consume tells us that on average, people will only spend 75% of their change in income. In this case, change in income that's facilitated through a tax cut. So to get the same bang for their buck, the government would have to cut taxes by a total of $133 billion to shift aggregate demand by the same $400 billion to the right to close that recessionary gap. Right? Now, I just spoke of this, the idea of, typically if you're a left-leaning, bigger government, democratic advocate, you're a proponent of more government spending, just like we have in with the Biden administration. If you're more of a conservative like Ronald Reagan, you're more of a proponent of tax cuts. Now, there's another level above and beyond the obvious here. When we revisit our friend allocative efficiency, there is an argument to be made that when you give hardworking Americans money, they're going to spend it where they are maximizing your utility. So this idea of consumer sovereignty, you give me a tax cut, it's more efficient because I go spend it where I see fit. As opposed to government projects, who knows if these green projects, right? We're already worried about this investment in EVs. It might end up being a wasteful billions of dollars because maybe the EVs never be, maybe they never get traction in the automobile industry, and the government spent billions on projects that were never really successful, right? So it's a really good question. Now, this is further down the road, but definitely worthwhile thinking about. Let's assume for the moment that there was a balanced budget before the recession. I just make it simple. Say there was $4 trillion worth of government expenditures last year and $4 trillion worth of government revenues at the federal level. And then the economy slips into a recession. It doesn't matter if tax cuts, the indirect approach to increasing aggregate demand, or government spending is used as the expansionary fiscal policy tool. Both will add to the size of the federal budget deficit for that year. Now, theoretically, again, tax cuts would add more to the deficit because any tax cut would have to be larger than any increase in government spending. Right? Now, one final point, I've said this before, but make sure you are able to calculate both the size of the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. Right? So for this one, the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. That would have to be given. All right, it's easy to calculate the spending multiplier. 1 over 1 minus 0.75 is 1 over 0.25 is 4. And then just remember that the spending multiplier is always 1 less than the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the spending multiplier. All right, time to talk about the other possible government action to correct a economic problem. Let's look on the right and say, oh, geez, what's going on here? Too much money chasing too few goods. We have what? An inflation gap, right? We were at full employment domestic output. We were at potential GDP. And then aggregate demand shifted rightward. So in this economy, think about what's going on with our three macroeconomic variables. If currently we have an inflationary gap, real GDP is beyond potential GDP. How do we do that? Well, we must have unemployment below the natural rate of unemployment, right? But that excess spending is driving up price level. So in this economy, aggregate price level, inflation is the problem. So if you look at this, this graph on the right, this aggregate demand, aggregate supply, representation of macroeconomic GDP, begin to immediately evaluate what's going on with our three variables and then determine what should the government do to address the issue. So in this case, what is called for is contractionary fiscal policy aimed at reducing or decreasing aggregate demand. Take a little wind out of the sails of the economy. Right? Well, how in the heck will the government go about accomplishing this goal? Same tools in the toolbox, but just in the opposite direction. So the government can cut spending or reduce purchases of goods and services. The government can increase taxes, or the government can reduce transfer payments. So remember, the direct versus indirect approach and the impact on aggregate demand. All three of these fiscal policy tool options are aimed at decreasing aggregate demand. Right? Cut government spending, increase taxes, or cut transfer payments. Right? Now, if successful, the idea is that given the fact that we have an inflationary gap, cutting government spending, increasing taxes, or decreasing transfer payments should help to slow spending, shifting aggregate demand from its current level where there's an inflationary gap back towards potential GDP. Right? Now, ask yourself an extremely realistic question. If the economy is experiencing inflation, theoretically, yes, the federal government can raise taxes, cut transfer payments, so welfare, unemployment, right, disability incomes, and or cut government programs, cut spending, right? So those don't seem like tremendously popular policy options. So this would be a question on the AP exam. If you look at this initial graph and say, what's going on? Boom, right away, right? Demand pull inflation, inflationary gap, too much money chasing too few goods, contractionary fiscal policy is in order. Answer the question as you would be, you would expect them to answer you. In the real world, when there's inflation and inflationary gap, the more likely option will be monetary policy, which we will talk about very soon in this class and which we've been seeing in the real world for the past, year and a half with the Fed raising interest rates multiple times, right? But concentrate on fiscal policy for now, boys. This slide revisits a question we introduced earlier about when is it appropriate to implement either expansionary fiscal policy to address uh, a negative recessionary gap or a contractionary fiscal policy in response to a positive shock or an inflationary gap. So, should the government implement expansionary fiscal policy? And again, the answer is it depends on the size of the issue. When it's obvious that the economy is headed into the abyss, there's very few politicians and economists that argue that fiscal stimulus, expansionary fiscal policy isn't in order. And now this slide's interesting here on the right because it says, okay, should contractionary fiscal policy be implemented to address um, demand pull inflation, aka an inflationary gap? And it says here the gains from an inflationary gap must be paid back later. I actually talked to 3 colleagues about this. And the idea that, okay, must be paid back later because inflation is eroding purchasing power. The last and final idea here is that policymakers, it says, agree that, to some magnitude, even to address demand pull inflation, that contractionary fiscal policy would be in order. Again, this is open to debate. In a previous lecture, we introduced the period of time in U.S. economic history in the late 70s and the early 80s where the price of oil skyrocketed. This negative supply shock caused what's referred to as stagflation, a leftward shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve. Right? Serious increase in the price of necessary inputs meant that the economy simultaneously suffered through less real output. Look what happens here from QF to Q1, a leftward shift in real GDP, and upward pressure on prices. So stagflation, this is called. The economy is reeling from higher unemployment with contracting GDP and higher than desirable inflation, stagflation. What policy measures are available to the federal government to address cost push inflation? You've heard that expression, stuck between a rock and a hard place. So supply shocks, as just described there, right, complicates the issue. Now, why is that, right? Okay, so we already talked about what happens, right? So we have a leftward shift in aggregate supply caused by serious increase in the price of a necessary resource, oil. We also talk about the pandemic supply shock, right? Now that causes a problem because we got all of our variables moving in the wrong direction. Real GDP is falling, unemployment is rising. At the same time, price level is increasing. So what should the federal government do as far as fiscal policy options? Well, perhaps the federal government could try to relieve recessionary issues of weak GDP and high unemployment by using expansionary fiscal policy, right? Cutting taxes and increasing government spending, but that would cause more inflation. On the other hand, if the government addressed the inflationary problem, well, then they would have to cut government spending and increase taxes. And then what would that do? Geez, that would just make the recession worse, right? So again, the government is handcuffed. Neither option looks very appealing. Right? The government could use expansionary fiscal policy, increase government spending, cut taxes, but that'll cause more inflation. Or the government can cut government spending and increase taxes to try to adjust inflation, and that'll just cause more or higher unemployment and weaker GDP. You will not be given the formulas for the spending multiplier or the tax multiplier on the AP exam. So make sure you are able to calculate these, memorize these formulas. And how do you calculate the size of the expenditure or spending multiplier? 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. The tax multiplier is simply what? MPC over MPS, but remember the trick. The tax multiplier is always one less than the spending multiplier. Let me give you a quick example. If the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, what's the size of the spending multiplier? 1 over 1 minus 0.9, 1 over 0.1. 1 over 0.1 is 10. By default, that means the tax multiplier has to be 9. But the math works out to prove this. 0.9 over 0.1 is what? It's 9. Right? But make sure you are familiar with and have memorized these formulas. Now we're going to add some math to our analysis of fiscal policy. Always evaluate what's going on with the economy, then determine what type of fiscal policy is in order to address the economic issue at hand. Down bottom on the right, we notice that there is a recessionary gap. Potential GDP is 500 billion. Actual GDP is 300 billion. We have a $200 billion recessionary gap, the difference between actual economic output, real GDP, and potential GDP. So expansionary fiscal policy is in order. Let's assume that the government's going to use government spending to close that recessionary gap. It tells you in this problem that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. Therefore, what is the size of the multiplier, right? We just went over this on the previous slide. 1 over 1 minus 0.8. The multiplier is 5. So if there is a recessionary gap of 200 billion, right? How much government spending is necessary to close that gap? Well, they give you the formula here. It says change in government spending. So the amount of money that the government spends, all right, times the size of the multiplier will give you the answer. And for this one, it's straight for you, right? As long as the government spends a total of $40 billion, that recessionary gap will be closed. Right? Again, how do we get that? Real quick review. $200 billion recessionary gap, the difference between the $500 billion in potential GDP versus the $300 billion in actual GDP. It's given in the problem that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. 1 over 1 minus 0.8 is 1 over 0.2. 1 divided by 0.2 is 5. The multiplier is 5. If the government spends $40 billion on new bridges, right? Let's assume they spend on all bridges. Increase in government spending of $40 billion after the multiplier effect, aggregate demand shifts back to the right, a total of $200 billion, closing that recessionary gap. And it worked perfectly. All right, sports fans, economic students, same scenario. We still have a $200 billion economic gap, a recessionary gap, right? We look at the difference between actual GDP at 300 billion versus potential GDP at 500 billion, recessionary gap. But in this case, instead of using the government spending approach to increasing aggregate demand, we're going to use the indirect approach. We're going to use tax cuts to address the recessionary gap. We got the same scenario here. Marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. That tells you that on average, Americans will spend 80% of that tax cuts. So if you give me $100, I'm going to spend 80 of it. If you give me $1,000, I'm going to spend what? 800 of it. Now remember, it's an average. All right. Sally Saver and Frugal Frank, they're going to save all of it, and then there's going to be somebody that spends all of it. So the marginal propensity to consume says, on average, what percentage of change in income will be spent? Now, again, you should know this intuitively, but any increase in or any cut in taxes, any tax cut is going to have to be larger than any increase in government spending for that very reason. Some people will save a portion of that tax cut. On average, they'll save 20% if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. The marginal propensity to save is 0.2 or 20%. So you set up this little equation, right? You say, all right, what change in taxes times our tax multiplier will ultimately equal 200 billion, right? So we do the tax multiplier part first, but we already know this. On the previous slide, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, that makes the spending multiplier 5. The tax multiplier is always 1 less. Or we could do it the long way, right? 0.8 over 0.2. Tax multiplier is 4. In this case, the government has to cut taxes by 50 billion to get that same increase in aggregate demand, that same rightward shift in aggregate demand to close that recessionary gap. The book likes to give you these reminders. So again, right? Tax multiplier is always 1 less than the expenditures or spending multiplier. And when we talk about changes in tax cuts or transfer payments, the idea of the indirect approach or the indirect impact, all right, because only a fraction of that money makes its way into the economy because some of it is saved. All right, the other problem, in this case, now we have a what? An inflationary gap. Aggregate demand is shifted to the right past, right, full employment domestic output or potential GDP. So we look and say, okay, actual GDP is at 600 billion, potential is still 500 billion. We have a $100 billion inflationary gap. How do we close that inflationary gap? Immediately you need to identify the problem, right? The problem is inflationary gap. And then, okay, what is in order? Well, now we need contractionary fiscal policy. Let's assume instead of using any manipulation with taxes, we're just going to finagle government spending. And we want aggregate demand to decrease. We want aggregate demand to shift to the left. That means we need to have a decrease in government spending. Well, how big of a decrease in government spending will get our total leftward shift of aggregate demand of 100 billion to close that inflationary gap? All right, the scenario is the same here. Marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. Therefore, multiplier, that is to say spending multiplier, is still 5. 1 over 1 minus 0.8, 1 over 0.2. Spending multiplier is 5. So now we have to look and say, okay, we know that the spending multiplier is 5. Well, what times 5 equals 100? All right, you guys are good at math. All right, you guessed it. If the government cuts spending by $20 billion, this will ultimately have a multiplied effect on aggregate demand, shifting aggregate demand to the left, closing that inflationary gap back to full employment domestic output, aka potential GDP, back to our 500 billion level. Same economic problem, right? We have an inflationary gap, demand pull inflation, too much money chasing too few goods. We just evaluated how the government can cut government spending to close that inflationary gap. The size of the inflationary gap, 100 billion. The difference between actual GDP as pictured here, 600 billion, and our potential GDP of 500 billion. We want to shift aggregate demand to the left, and we know that there's going to be this multiplier effect. But if we use increases in taxes as opposed to cuts in government spending, how much of an increase in taxes will be necessary to close that inflationary gap? Again, the marginal propensity to consume for this economy is 0.8, which makes the size of the tax multiplier 4. How did we get that? Either we remember that the tax multiplier is always 1 less than the spending multiplier, or we do the long way, 0.8 over 0.2, right? So in this case, the Democrats are in office. They see an inflationary gap, and they see an opportunity to raise taxes on the wealthy. So how much does the government need to raise taxes to close that inflationary gap, right? So something times 4 will equal 100 billion. So if the government raises taxes by 25 billion, ultimately we will close that gap, right? 4 tax multiplier times $25 billion increase in taxes, we close the inflationary gap. Aggregate demand has shifted to the left, and price level in the economy has come back down towards earth.